Margaret Sullivan had always been different from her neighbors in the quiet town of Ashwood, Connecticut. While other 70-year-old widows spent their afternoons playing bridge or watching television, she spent hers dusting off the massive upright piano that dominated her small living room. The instrument was an eyesore, according to her daughter Linda, who visited every Sunday with the same complaint. "Mom, please," Linda said, one chilly October afternoon, setting down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. "That thing takes up half the room. When are you going to get rid of it? Nobody even plays it anymore since Dad passed." Margaret ran her wrinkled fingers along the piano's dark walnut surface, tracing the elaborate carvings that decorated its front panel. The wood was scratched and faded in places, and several of the ivory keys had yellowed to the color of old teeth. To anyone else, it looked like junk. To Margaret, it was the last connection to her late husband, Thomas, who had bought it at an estate sale 40 years ago. "Your father loved this piano," Margaret said quietly. "He always said it had character. Said it reminded him of the one his grandmother owned back in Germany." Linda sighed, the same exasperated sound she'd been making since she was a teenager. "Dad bought a lot of things at estate sales. That doesn't mean we have to keep all of them forever. The antique dealer I called said it's not worth much, maybe $200 at best. It's not even a good brand. Hoffman & Sons went out of business decades ago." Margaret didn't respond. She'd heard this argument a dozen times before. Linda meant well. She knew that her daughter worried about her living alone in the old house, surrounded by memories and outdated furniture. But Margaret wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. After Linda left, Margaret sat down at the piano bench and lifted the fallboard, exposing the keys. She pressed middle C, and the note rang out, slightly out of tune but still clear. She'd never been much of a player herself, but Thomas used to spend hours at this piano, teaching their children simple melodies and occasionally attempting more complicated pieces from the yellowed sheet music they'd collected over the years. The house felt too quiet without him. It had been 3 years since the heart attack that took him suddenly one morning while he was reading the newspaper. 3 years of eating dinner alone, of sleeping in an empty bed, of making decisions without his gentle input. The piano was more than just wood and strings to her. It was the sound of Thomas humming while he played, the feeling of his hand guiding hers across the keys, the laughter when they both hit wrong notes. That evening, as Margaret prepared for bed, she made a decision. Tomorrow she would call someone to tune the piano properly. If she was going to keep arguing with Linda about it, the least she could do was make sure it was in decent playing condition. She found a business card in her address book, a piano technician named Robert Chen who had tuned it years ago. Robert arrived the following Tuesday morning, carrying a worn leather tool bag and wearing a friendly smile. He was younger than Margaret expected, perhaps in his early 40s. With graying hair at his temples and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, shaking her hand. "I remember this piano. I tuned it for your husband several times. Beautiful instrument. These old Hoffmans are rare these days." Margaret felt a warmth in her chest at his words. Finally, someone who appreciated the piano for what it was. She offered him tea, which he politely declined, and then watched as he began his work. He opened the top panel, exposing the strings and hammers inside, and started testing each note with a small electronic device. "How long has it been since the last tuning?" Robert asked, adjusting something with a specialized wrench. "About 4 years," Margaret admitted. "Not since Thomas passed away." Robert nodded sympathetically and continued working. He moved methodically from one end of the keyboard to the other, tightening strings and testing pitches. Margaret sat in her armchair, watching him work and remembering Thomas doing the same thing all those years ago when Robert's predecessor had visited. After about an hour, Robert paused. He was leaning deep into the piano's interior, his flashlight illuminating something Margaret couldn't see. His expression changed from concentration to surprise. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said slowly, "have you ever looked inside this piano? I mean really looked." Margaret stood up and walked over. "Just when it's been opened for tuning." "Why? Is something wrong?" Robert gestured for her to come closer. He pointed his flashlight toward the back of the soundboard, where the wood met the frame. There, carved into the wood in tiny, precise letters, was something Margaret had never noticed before. Words, lots of them. They covered nearly every inch of the hidden interior surface. "What is that?" Margaret whispered, leaning in to get a better look. "I'm not entirely sure," Robert said, his voice filled with curiosity. "But this isn't normal. Someone carved messages or maybe instructions into the wood. This would have taken hours, maybe days to do. And look at this." He moved his flashlight to another section. "These aren't in English. At least, not all of them. Some look like German, maybe." Margaret's heart began to beat faster. Thomas's grandmother had been from Germany. He'd mentioned it whenever he looked at the piano, saying something about the craftsmanship, reminding him of the old country. But he'd never said anything about hidden writing. "Can you read any of it?" she asked. Robert shook his head. "My German is pretty limited. But Mrs. Sullivan, if I were you, I'd want to know what this says. This piano might be more interesting than anyone realized. This kind of thing, hidden messages in furniture, sometimes they're significant. Sometimes they're historical documents or family records. Sometimes they're even valuable." Margaret stared at the tiny carved letters, her mind racing. For years, everyone had told her the piano was worthless, just an old piece of furniture taking up space. Her daughter wanted her to throw it away. The antique dealer had dismissed it as common. But now, standing here looking at these mysterious words hidden in its interior, Margaret realized that Thomas might have been right all along. This piano did have character. It had secrets, and she was determined to find out what they were. Margaret barely slept that night. She kept thinking about the carved words hidden inside her piano, wondering what they might mean and why someone would go to such trouble to hide them there. By 6 in the morning, she was already dressed and making coffee, planning her next move. She needed someone who could read German. Someone who could help her understand what message had been concealed in the instrument for all these years. She called Linda first, but her daughter's reaction was predictably dismissive. "Mum, it's probably just the manufacturer's marks or serial numbers. Don't get worked up over some scratches inside an old piano." But Margaret knew what she'd seen. Those weren't scratches or random marks. They were deliberate, carefully carved words that formed sentences and paragraphs. Robert Chen had seen them too, and his surprise had been genuine. This was something unusual, something worth investigating. Margaret remembered that her neighbor, Helen Kowalski, had a grandson who taught at the university in Hartford. He was a professor of something to do with languages. She walked next door and knocked, catching Helen just as she was leaving for her morning walk. "Margaret, dear, what has you up so early?" Helen asked, adjusting her walking shoes on the front porch. "I need a favor," Margaret said. "Your grandson, the one who teaches at the university. Does he know German?" Helen's face brightened. "David. Oh yes, he teaches European history and linguistics, speaks German, French, and I think Polish too." "Why do you ask?" Margaret explained about the piano and the hidden writing. Helen's eyes grew wide with interest, and within the hour she'd called her grandson and arranged for him to visit that very afternoon. Margaret spent the morning cleaning her house and trying to calm her nerves. She felt silly for being so excited about some old carvings, but she couldn't help herself. For the first time in 3 years, she felt truly curious about something, truly engaged with the world around her. David Kowalski arrived at 2 o'clock, a tall young man with messy brown hair and an eager expression. He carried a notebook and a good flashlight, and he listened intently as Margaret explained what Robert Chen had discovered during the piano tuning. "This is fascinating, Mrs. Sullivan," David said, kneeling beside the piano and opening the top panel. Hidden inscriptions in furniture were actually fairly common in certain time periods, especially during wars or periods of persecution. People would hide information, family records, even maps inside everyday objects. He shined his flashlight into the piano's interior and let out a low whistle. "Wow, there's a lot here. And you're right, this is definitely German. Old German too, from the look of the script style. Probably early to mid-20th century." Margaret watched anxiously as David began reading, his lips moving silently as he translated in his head. His expression grew more and more serious as he moved his light from section to section. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sat back on his heels and looked up at her. "Mrs. Sullivan, I think you need to sit down for this," he said gently. Margaret's hands trembled as she lowered herself into her armchair. "What does it say?" David consulted his notes. "It's a diary of sorts. Or maybe more accurately, a record. It was written by a man named Jakob Hoffmann, and if I'm reading this correctly, he was one of the craftsmen who built this piano. The dates he mentions suggest it was made in 1938, in a workshop in Berlin." "Berlin?" Margaret's breath caught. Thomas's grandmother was from Berlin. She came to America before the war. David nodded slowly. That might not be a coincidence. Mrs. Sullivan Jakob Hoffmann writes about what was happening in Germany at that time. He describes the growing persecution of Jewish people, the restrictions, the violence. He mentions that his workshop employed several Jewish craftsmen who were being forced out of their jobs. And then he writes about something specific. He says that he and his workers decided to use their pianos to smuggle information and valuables out of Germany. Margaret felt dizzy. Smuggle? What do you mean? According to what's written here, they would hollow out small spaces in the piano frames and soundboards, places where things could be hidden. Documents, jewelry, money, anything small and flat. Then they'd seal them up and sell the pianos to families who were emigrating to America or other countries. It was a way to help people escape with their family treasures and important papers that the Nazi government wouldn't let them take legally. The room seemed to spin around Margaret. She thought about Thomas, about how he'd always said this piano was special, how he'd insisted on buying it despite it being more expensive than they could really afford at the time. Had he known? Had his grandmother told him something? "David," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "If they were hiding things in these pianos, does that mean there might still be something hidden in mine?" The young professor's eyes met hers, and she saw the same thought reflected there. There might be. Jakob Hoffmann's writing explains the technique they used. He says they created false backs in the soundboard area, spaces that wouldn't affect the piano's sound but could hold thin objects. If this piano was one of the ones used for smuggling, and if whatever was hidden was never found, then yes, there could still be something inside. Margaret's mind raced. She thought about Linda's words, about how the piano should be thrown away, sold off, forgotten. What if she'd done that? What if she'd let them take it to the dump, or sold it for $200 to someone who would have broken it apart for scrapwood? Whatever was hidden inside would have been lost forever. "We need to look," she said firmly. "We need to check if there's anything still hidden." David hesitated. "Mrs. Sullivan, I should warn you. If we find something, if there are historical documents or valuables, this could get complicated. There might be legal issues, questions about ownership, maybe even rightful heirs looking for family heirlooms. This isn't something to take lightly." "I understand," Margaret said, "but we have to know. If someone trusted this piano to carry something precious across the ocean, to save it from the Nazis, then we owe it to them to find out what it was. Don't we?" David smiled. "Yes, I think we do. But we should document everything carefully. I'd like to bring my colleague, Professor Morris, who specializes in World War II history, and we should probably contact the university's preservation department. If there are historical documents inside, we need to handle them properly." Margaret agreed, though part of her wanted to tear the piano apart immediately to see what secrets it held. But David was right. This needed to be done carefully, respectfully. Whatever was hidden had been placed there by someone desperate, someone trying to save something precious from destruction. She could wait a little longer. David spent another hour photographing the inscriptions and taking detailed notes. Before he left, he promised to return in 2 days with his colleague and the proper equipment to search the piano without damaging it. Margaret walked him to the door, thanking him profusely. After he left, she stood alone in her living room, staring at the piano with new eyes. It wasn't just a piece of furniture anymore. It was a time capsule, a rescue mission frozen in wood and strings for over 80 years. And she, Margaret Sullivan, The woman everyone said was too sentimental about old junk was the guardian of whatever story it still had to tell. The 2 days of waiting felt like 2 months to Margaret. She found herself sitting beside the piano for hours, running her hands along its surface, trying to imagine the craftsman who had built it in that Berlin workshop so long ago. She thought about Jakob Hoffmann and his brave decision to help people escape with their treasures. How many pianos had they made? How many families had they helped? She tried calling Thomas's cousin, Arthur, who was the last living connection to Thomas's grandmother's side of the family. Arthur was 92 and lived in a nursing home in Massachusetts. When Margaret finally reached him, his memory was foggy, but he did remember something important. "Grandma Hoffmann," Arthur said, his voice thin and distant over the phone. "She never talked much about the old country, but I remember she had a piano. She cried when they had to leave it behind in Berlin. Then, years later, maybe 39 or 40, someone shipped her a piano from New York. She said it was a miracle, that it looked just like the one she'd had to abandon. She played it every day until she died." Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the phone. "Arthur, do you know what happened to that piano after she died?" "Estate sale, I think. Your Thomas bought a bunch of her things. He was always sentimental about Grandma." "Why do you ask?" After Margaret explained what they'd discovered, Arthur went quiet for a long moment. "You mean all these years, Grandma's piano was sitting in your house, the one she cried over?" "Margaret, you have to find out what's inside. She used to touch that piano like it was made of gold. I always thought she just loved music, but maybe there was another reason." That conversation made the waiting even harder. Margaret barely ate and couldn't focus on her usual routines. She didn't call Linda again, knowing her daughter would only try to talk her out of the investigation. This was something Margaret needed to see through on her own. Finally, Thursday morning arrived. David Kowalski came back with an older man wearing wire-rimmed spectacles and a tweed jacket that looked like it came from another era. Professor Leonard Morris had kind eyes and an air of quiet authority. Behind them came a younger woman carrying what looked like medical equipment in padded cases. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Professor Morris and Dr. Sarah Chen from our preservation department." David introduced them. Dr. Chen specializes in historical document conservation. They all shook hands, and Margaret noticed Dr. Chen was looking at the piano with intense interest. "David showed me the photographs of the inscriptions," she said. "This is quite remarkable. I've heard of a few cases like this, but I've never actually seen one in person." Professor Morris walked slowly around the piano, examining it from every angle. "Hoffmann and Sons," he murmured, reading the manufacturer's name on the front panel. "I've come across that name in my research. They had a small workshop in the Mid-District of Berlin, employed about 15 craftsmen before the war. Several of them were Jewish. The workshop was shut down by the Nazis in 1939. What happened to the workers?" Margaret asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Professor Morris's expression grew somber. "Most of them disappeared into the camps. Only a few escaped. But their pianos made it out. We know from immigration records that dozens of Hoffmann pianos entered the United States between 1938 and 1940, right before emigration became impossible. Your piano might be one of the last ones they made." Dr. Chen set up her equipment on Margaret's dining room table. She had special lights, magnifying glasses, and tools that looked like they belonged in a surgical theater. "We'll use an endoscope first," she explained. "It's a tiny camera that we can insert into small openings without having to take the piano apart. If we see something, then we'll discuss the best way to extract it safely." Margaret watched as they carefully removed the back panel of the piano, exposing the wooden sound. David pointed out where the inscriptions were, and Professor Morris took more photographs while dictating notes into a small recording device. The academic process felt both too slow and intensely fascinating. Then, Dr. Chen brought over her endoscope, a thin, flexible tube with a camera and light at the tip. She studied the soundboard carefully, running her fingers along the wood grain, tapping gently in different places. Suddenly, she stopped. "Here," she said. "Do you hear that? This section sounds hollow, different from the rest." She made a tiny mark with a pencil, then carefully inserted the endoscope through a gap between the soundboard and the frame. Everyone crowded around the small monitor that showed what the camera was seeing. At first, there was only darkness and the texture of old wood. Then the camera moved deeper, and something appeared on the screen. A package, brown paper, yellowed with age, tied with what might have once been string but was now just brittle fiber. It was wedged tightly into a space between the true back of the piano and a false panel that Jakob Hoffman and his workers had installed. "Oh my God," David whispered. "There really is something there." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. All these years, while she dusted the piano and defended it against Linda's complaints and ignored the antique dealer's dismissal, this package had been waiting silently inside. Thomas's grandmother had known. She was sure of it now. The old woman had received this piano and understood what it carried. But why hadn't she ever retrieved what was hidden? Dr. Chen withdrew the endoscope. "We need to open the false panel to get that package out. I can do it, but we have to be extremely careful. The wood is old and brittle, and whatever is inside that paper is probably very fragile." "Mrs. Sullivan, this is your piano and your decision. Do you want us to proceed?" Margaret looked around at the three expectant faces. These people, who had been strangers just days ago, now stood in her living room, about to help her uncover a mystery that had waited 8 decades to be solved. She thought about Thomas, about his grandmother, about Jakob Hoffman, and all those desperate craftsmen trying to save what they could from darkness and destruction. "Yes," she said firmly. "Open it. Whatever is inside deserves to see daylight again." Dr. Chen put on white cotton gloves and selected a thin metal tool from her case. Professor Morris positioned lights to illuminate the work area. David readied his camera to document everything. And Margaret sat down in her armchair, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The work was painstaking and slow. Dr. Chen used various tools to carefully separate the false panel from the soundboard, working along the seams where Jakob Hoffman had glued it in place 80 years before. Bits of old glue flaked away. Wood creaked and protested. Margaret found herself holding her breath, terrified that something would break or that the package would crumble to dust at the first touch. After nearly an hour, Dr. Chen had created an opening large enough to reach inside. She looked at Margaret. "Would you like to take it out? This is your family's piano. You should be the one." Margaret stood on shaky legs and approached the piano. Dr. Chen handed her a pair of white gloves, which she pulled on with trembling fingers. She reached into the dark space, and her fingers touched paper, dry and fragile as butterfly wings. Carefully, so carefully, she grasped the package and began to pull it free. The package came free with a soft whisper of old paper against wood. Margaret held it in both hands, amazed at how light it was, how fragile it felt. The brown paper wrapping had darkened with age, and the string that had once bound it was now just a few brittle strands. She could see writing on the outer surface, faded but still visible. German words in careful, slanted handwriting. "Let me photograph it before we open it," David said, his voice hushed with reverence. He took pictures from every angle, capturing the writing, the knots in the string, the way the paper had creased and folded over the years. Professor Morris leaned in close, studying the inscription. "Family Bergman," he read slowly. "That's the name written here. Family Bergman, and this looks like an address in Berlin, Schanhauser Allee, that was in the Jewish quarter." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She was holding something that belonged to a family named Bergman. A family who had lived in Berlin when the world was falling apart around them. A family who had trusted Jakob Hoffman to save something precious for them. Dr. Chen spread a large white cloth on Margaret's dining room table and set up special lighting. "Let's open it here, where we can see properly and keep everything contained. Mrs. Sullivan, I'll help you, but you should do the unwrapping." Margaret sat down at the table, the package in front of her. Her hands shook as she began to carefully work at the old string. It crumbled at her touch, falling away in tiny pieces. The paper wrapping was next. She unfolded it slowly, terrified that it would tear or that whatever was inside would be damaged. Dr. Chen used a soft brush to help separate sections that had stuck together. Inside the brown paper was another layer of wrapping, this one made of thin cloth, possibly silk. It was yellowed and stained, but had protected the contents better than paper alone could have. Margaret unwrapped the cloth with Dr. Chen's help, and finally, the contents of the package lay exposed on the table. Photographs, dozens of them, black and white, various sizes. They showed people, buildings, moments frozen in time. There was also a small leather book, possibly a diary or journal, and several official-looking documents with stamps and seals. And beneath everything else, wrapped in a separate piece of silk, was jewelry. A necklace with what looked like rubies, a pair of earrings, a man's pocket watch with Hebrew letters engraved on the case. Dear God, Professor Morris breathed. This is someone's entire life. Their family history, their valuables, their identity, all hidden in a piano. Margaret picked up one of the photographs with gloved hands. It showed a young couple on their wedding day. The bride wore a long white dress with lace sleeves, and the groom looked proud in a formal suit. They stood in front of what appeared to be a synagogue, surrounded by smiling family members. On the back, someone had written in German. David leaned over to translate, Hochzeit von Ruth, under Samuel Bergman, 15 Juni, 1935, Wedding of Ruth and Samuel Bergman. June 15, 1935. Another photograph showed a little girl, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, sitting on a tricycle and laughing at the camera. On the back, in Zira Klein Hannah, 1936, Our Little Hannah, 1936. There were more photos. Family gatherings, birthday parties, holiday celebrations, a prosperous-looking couple who might have been grandparents. Young men in university caps. Women in elegant dresses at what looked like a concert or theater. Each photograph was a window into a world that had been destroyed. Professor Morris carefully opened the leather journal, handling it as if it were made of glass. The pages inside were covered in the same careful handwriting that had been on the package's outer wrapping. This appears to be a record book, he said. Family births, deaths, marriages going back several generations. And look at this. He pointed to a section near the middle of the book. This is a family tree. The Bergman family, traced back to the early 1800s. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the weight of what lay before her. These weren't just objects. They were the Bergman family's attempt to preserve their existence. To make sure that even if they didn't survive, their story would. They had trusted their precious memories and valuables to a piano, hoping it would carry them to safety across an ocean. Mrs. Sullivan, look at this document, Dr. Chen said, pointing to an official paper with multiple stamps and signatures. This is a property deed. The Bergman family owned a building in Berlin. This deed proves their ownership. And these other papers, they look like bank documents, investment records, proof of wealth and assets. David was examining another document. This is a birth certificate. Hannah Bergman, born October 3, 1933. And here's another one. Smaller, looks like it might be a citizenship paper or identification document. Margaret's throat tightened. These people, do you think they survived the war? Professor Morris's expression was grave. That's what we need to find out. But Mrs. Sullivan, you need to understand something. These items, especially the legal documents and the jewelry, they might belong to surviving family members or descendants. If the Bergmans had children or relatives who made it through the Holocaust, this could be incredibly important to them. These photographs alone would be priceless to anyone trying to reconstruct their family history. Of course, Margaret said immediately, we have to find them. We have to try to return these things to whoever they belong to. That's what Thomas's grandmother would have wanted. That's what the Bergmans wanted when they hid these things. The question was how to find them. David suggested starting with Holocaust survivor databases and immigration records. Professor Morris knew of several organizations that specialized in reuniting families with lost property and documents. Dr. Chen carefully photographed every item, creating a digital archive that could be shared with researchers and genealogists. As they worked, Margaret found herself drawn back to the photographs. She studied each face, trying to imagine who these people had been. The proud father holding his infant daughter. The elderly woman reading in a garden. The young man in military uniform from the First World War. These were real people who had lived full lives. Who had loved and laughed and celebrated together. And then history had swept them away. One photograph in particular caught her attention. It showed the entire family gathered in what looked like a living room. In the background, barely visible, was a piano. Margaret picked up the photo and looked closer. It was definitely a piano, and it looked remarkably similar to the one sitting in her living room. "David, look at this," she said, showing him the photograph. "Is that the same piano?" David examined it with a magnifying glass. "The shape is right. The decorative carvings on the front panel look very similar. And see here, you can just make out part of a name on the front. It could say, Hoffman. Mrs. Sullivan, I think this might actually be a photograph of this very piano. Taken in the Bergman home in Berlin before they had to give it up." The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. The piano that had been sitting in her living room for 40 years, the piano that Thomas had bought at an estate sale, the piano that everyone had told her to throw away, had once stood in a home in Berlin. The Bergman family had played it, gathered around it, made memories with it, and when they were forced to leave everything behind, Jakob Hoffman and his workers had found a way to hide their most precious belongings inside it and send it across the ocean. But then, what had happened? How had Thomas's grandmother ended up with this piano, and why had she never retrieved what was hidden inside? Professor Morris had been studying the documents carefully. Now he looked up, with a troubled expression. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've found something else. There's a letter here, tucked between the pages of the family record book. It's addressed to whoever finds this. It's in German, but I can translate it." Everyone gathered around as Professor Morris began to read the letter aloud, translating as he went. The words had been written by Samuel Bergman, the man in the wedding photograph, and they told a story that made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. Professor Morris's voice was steady but emotional as he translated Samuel Bergman's letter. The words had been written in November 1938, just after Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when Nazi mobs had destroyed Jewish businesses, homes, and synagogues across Germany. "To whoever finds this," the letter began, "if you are reading these words, then you have discovered what my family and I have hidden in the hope of preserving something of ourselves. My name is Samuel Bergman. I am 42 years old. My wife Ruth is 39. Our daughter Hannah is 5. We owned a successful printing business in Berlin for 3 generations, but that is gone now. Everything is gone except what we have managed to hide here." Professor Morris paused, his glasses slightly fogged. He wiped them and continued reading. "We purchased this piano from the Hoffman workshop in 1934, when the world still seemed sane. It has been the center of our home, where Ruth plays Chopin and Brahms, where Hannah is learning her first simple melodies. But now Herr Jakob Hoffman has come to us with an extraordinary offer. He says he can help us save what matters most, not the piano itself, but our family's memory and our proof of what we owned, what we were." Margaret listened, transfixed, as the story unfolded. Samuel explained that he and Ruth had secured passage to Shanghai, one of the few places still accepting Jewish refugees without visas. They were scheduled to leave in December 1938, but they were only allowed to take 10 marks and a single suitcase per person. Everything else, their home, their business, their savings, their possessions, would be confiscated by the Nazi state. Jakob Hoffman told us about his plan, the letter continued. He will take our piano, claiming to purchase it for export to America. Inside, he will hide our family photographs, our records, the deed to our building, my grandmother's jewelry, and these documents that prove we existed, that we were citizens, that we owned property and had rights. He will send the piano to his brother-in-law in New York, a man named Friedrich Hoffman who emigrated to America in 1936. Friedrich will hold the piano safely until we can claim it. But then the letter took a darker turn. Samuel wrote that he had heard disturbing reports from Jews who had already left Germany. Many were not finding safety where they had hoped. Shanghai was becoming dangerous. Other countries were closing their borders. The world seemed to be abandoning the Jews to their fate. If something happens to us, Samuel wrote, if we do not survive to reclaim what we have hidden, then I ask, whoever finds this, to please give these items to my sister. Her name is Ilse Bergman, and she married a man named Stefan Hoffmann in 1932. Yes, Stefan is Jakob's cousin. Our families have been connected for generations. Ilse and Stefan emigrated to America in 1936. They live in New York. She is the only family I have left who is safe. If you can find her, please give her these photographs so she knows what happened to us. Give her the family records so our history is not lost. Give her our mother's jewelry so she has something to remember us by. The letter ended with an address in New York and a final plea. We are not criminals. We are not enemies. We are simply people who wanted to live our lives, raise our daughter, and contribute to the world. Please remember that we existed. Please remember that we loved each other. Please remember that we were human beings. Samuel Bergman. November 18, 1938. The room was silent when Professor Morris finished reading. Margaret wiped tears from her cheeks. David stood with his head bowed. Dr. Chen had her hand over her mouth. The weight of those words, written by a man who knew he might be writing his family's only epitaph, was almost unbearable. Ilse Bergman married Stefan Hoffmann, Margaret said slowly, the pieces clicking together in her mind. And Thomas's grandmother was Ilse Hoffmann. That's her. That's Samuel's sister. She was the person these things were meant for. Professor Morris nodded. And Friedrich Hoffmann, Jakob's brother-in-law in New York, must have sent the piano to Ilse, as Samuel requested. She received it, probably in 1939 or 1940, and she kept it for the rest of her life. But she never opened it. She never retrieved what was hidden inside. Why not? David asked. If she knew the piano contained her family's possessions, why leave them hidden? Margaret thought about what Arthur had told her on the phone. About Thomas's grandmother crying when she had to leave her piano in Berlin. About how she played the new piano every day. Maybe she couldn't bear to open it, Margaret said quietly. Maybe, as long as she didn't look inside, she could still hope that Samuel and Ruth and Hannah were alive somewhere. That they would come to America and claim their belongings themselves. Opening the piano would mean accepting that they were gone. Professor Morris's face was somber. We need to research what happened to Samuel Bergman and his family. The letter says they had passage to Shanghai in December 1938. We can check immigration records. Shanghai ghetto survivor lists, Holocaust databases. We need to know if they made it. Over the next few days, Professor Morris worked with colleagues at various research institutions and Holocaust memorial centers. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the Bergman family. She looked at their photographs every day, especially the one of little Hannah on her tricycle, laughing with such innocent joy. That little girl would be 92 years old now if she had survived. Was she still alive? Did she have children, grandchildren, a family of her own? David called Margaret 5 days after they had opened the piano. His voice was heavy with emotion. Mrs. Sullivan, we found records. Samuel, Ruth, and Hannah Bergman did make it to Shanghai in December 1938. They lived in the Shanghai ghetto during the Japanese occupation. It was a terrible place, overcrowded, disease-ridden, but they survived there until 1945. Margaret felt a surge of hope. So they lived through the war. Yes, David said, but there's more. After the war ended, they tried to return to Germany to reclaim their property and rebuild their lives. They arrived in Berlin in 1946, but Samuel died of tuberculosis less than 6 months later. He had contracted it in Shanghai and never recovered. Ruth and Hannah stayed in Germany for another year, trying to sort out the legal mess of reclaiming their home and business, but it was hopeless. The building had been destroyed in the bombing. The business assets had vanished, and the German government was in chaos. In 1947, Ruth and Hannah emigrated to the United States. Are they still alive? Margaret asked, hardly daring to breathe. Ruth died in 1989 in Philadelphia. But Mrs. Sullivan, Hannah is alive. Her married name is Hannah Bergman Fisher. She's 92 years old, and she lives in a retirement community in Pennsylvania. Professor Morris spoke with her on the phone yesterday. She remembers her parents, remembers Shanghai, remembers the piano they had in Berlin. She never knew that her father had hidden anything inside it. She thought all the family records and photographs were lost forever. Margaret sat down heavily, overwhelmed by relief and sorrow. Hannah had survived. The little girl on the tricycle had grown up, lived a life, made it to old age. But she had done so without any photographs of her childhood. Without the family records that could have told her about her grandparents and great-grandparents. Without her grandmother's jewelry that could have connected her to generations of women who had come before. When can she come here? Margaret asked. When can I give her back what belongs to her? David's voice was warm. She wants to come as soon as possible. Her daughter is going to drive her up from Pennsylvania this weekend. Mrs. Sullivan, you're giving her back her history. You're giving her proof that her family existed, that they mattered. You have no idea how much this means to her. But Margaret thought she did understand. She looked at the piano, the instrument that everyone had told her to throw away, and felt a profound sense of gratitude that she had been stubborn enough to keep it. Thomas had known, she was certain of it now. Maybe not consciously, maybe not with specific knowledge, but he had sensed that the piano was important. That's why he had bought it at his grandmother's estate sale. That's why he had insisted on keeping it, despite its flaws and imperfections. He had been protecting it, and by extension, protecting the Bergman family's legacy. Saturday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine, a warm October day that made the autumn leaves glow like fire. Margaret had barely slept, too anxious and excited about meeting Hannah Bergman. She had cleaned the house 3 times, arranged and rearranged the photographs and documents on her dining room table, and changed her clothes twice before settling on a simple blue dress that Thomas had always said brought out her eyes. David Kowalski arrived early, along with Professor Morris and Dr. Chen. They had brought archival boxes and proper storage materials for the photographs and documents, ensuring everything would be preserved correctly for Hannah. They had also prepared a complete digital archive, scanning every page, every photograph, so that Hannah would have backup copies of everything, even if the originals continued to deteriorate with age. Linda had called that morning, after Margaret finally told her what was happening. Her daughter's response had been predictable shock, followed by an apology that Margaret had graciously accepted. "I'm sorry I kept pushing you to get rid of the piano, Mum," Linda had said. "Dad would be so proud that you kept it. He always said you had good instincts." At 10 o'clock, a car pulled up outside. Margaret watched from the window as a middle-aged woman got out of the driver's side and walked around to help someone from the passenger seat. Hannah Bergman Fisher emerged slowly, using a cane, but moving with determination. She was small and thin, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a purple cardigan and carried a large handbag. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the resemblance to the little girl in the photographs. The same bright eyes, the same delicate features. Margaret met them at the door. Hannah's daughter, Rebecca, introduced herself first, shaking Margaret's hand warmly. Then Hannah stepped forward, and Margaret found herself looking into the eyes of a woman who had survived things Margaret could barely imagine. "Mrs. Sullivan," Hannah said, her voice accented with the traces of German she had spoken as a child. "I don't have words to thank you. Professor Morris told me what you found. I have been crying for 3 days. Happy tears, sad tears, I don't even know anymore." Margaret took Hannah's free hand gently. "Please, come in. Everything is waiting for you." They moved into the living room, where Hannah stopped abruptly when she saw the piano. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears spilled down her weathered cheeks. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, it's really the one. I remember it. I remember sitting on my mother's lap while she played. I remember my father singing while she played Schubert. I remember everything." Rebecca helped her mother to the sofa, and Hannah sat down, staring at the piano as if it were a ghost made solid. Margaret sat beside her, giving her time to absorb the moment. The others stood quietly in the background, respectful of the magnitude of this reunion. After several minutes, Hannah turned to Margaret. "May I see them?" The photographs. My father's letter. Of course, Margaret said. Everything is in the dining room. Take as much time as you need. They moved to the dining room table, where all the items from the piano had been carefully arranged. Hannah approached slowly, leaning on her cane and her daughter's arm. When she saw the photographs laid out before her, she let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "My mother," she said, touching the wedding photograph with trembling fingers. "Look how beautiful she was. And my father, so handsome. I remember this day from stories they told me, but I was too young to remember it myself. And here, oh God, here is my Oma, my grandmother. I was named after her other daughter, Hannah, who died before I was born. This is the only photograph I have ever seen of her." She moved from photograph to photograph, identifying people, sharing memories, crying and laughing in equal measure. Professor Morris had prepared translations of all the German writing on the backs of the photos, and Hannah read each one aloud, her voice breaking with emotion. When she saw the photograph of herself on the tricycle, she held it close to her chest and wept openly. "I don't remember this at all. I was so young, but my mother used to tell me about this tricycle, how I rode it up and down our street every day, how I rang the little bell to make people smile. She said I was fearless, always going too fast, always laughing. This is who I was before the world turned dark. This is the child my parents tried so hard to protect." Rebecca was crying too, seeing her mother's childhood revealed for the first time. "Mum, look at how happy you were. Look at that smile." Hannah picked up her father's letter next, the one addressed to whoever found the hidden package. Professor Morris had prepared a full translation, but Hannah read it in the original German, her lips moving silently as she absorbed her father's words from across 87 years. When she finished, she pressed the letter to her heart. "He was such a good man," she said quietly. "People don't understand what it was like, how quickly everything changed. One day, we were a normal family. My father had a business, my mother played piano, I went to kindergarten. The next day, we were marked as less than human. My father tried to shield me from it, but I saw things. I saw neighbors who had been friends turn away from us. I saw our synagogue burning. I saw my father's face the day they took away our business." She looked at Margaret with eyes that had seen too much suffering. "In Shanghai, we lived in one room. My father worked as a laborer, doing jobs that would have been beneath him before, but he never complained. My mother taught piano lessons to other refugee children for a few coins. I was sick all the time, but we were alive, and we were together, and my father always said that was what mattered. He said as long as we had each other, we had everything." Margaret listened, holding Hannah's hand. She thought about Samuel Bergman writing his letter, hiding his family's treasures in a piano, hoping against hope that they would survive. He had saved his family's memory, but he hadn't lived to see his daughter grow up, to see her survive and build a life in America. Hannah examined the jewelry next, the ruby necklace and earrings, the pocket watch with Hebrew engraving. "This was my grandmother's," she said, touching the necklace. "My father's mother, she died before I was born, but my father always spoke of her with such love. And this watch belonged to my grandfather. My father treasured it. He must have been heartbroken to hide it away, not knowing if he would ever see it again." She opened the family record book, studying the careful handwriting, the births and deaths recorded over generations. "This is my history," she said softly. "I have a son and daughter, 5 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. I have always wanted to tell them where they came from, who their ancestors were, but I had so little to show them. Just my memories, which grow foggier every year. Now I have proof. Now I have faces and names and dates. Now, I can give my family their roots." David had prepared a family tree based on the record book, and he showed it to Hannah. She studied it with amazement, seeing her lineage traced back to the early 1800s. "I never knew my great-great-grandparents' names," she said. "I never knew I had cousins in Frankfurt. My father tried to tell me these things when I was young, but I was too little to understand, and later, after he died, my mother was too grief-stricken to talk about the past. We just focused on surviving, on building new lives. The old world was lost to us." But now, it wasn't lost anymore. Margaret watched Hannah's face transform as she discovered her family's history, piece by piece. The documents proved that the Bergmans had owned property, had been successful and respected. The photographs showed celebrations and gatherings, evidence of a rich and full life before the Holocaust. The jewelry connected Hannah to grandmothers and great-grandmothers she had never known. Professor Morris explained that the property documents might still have legal value. The building in Berlin was gone, but there were restitution programs that might provide some compensation for losses. Hannah shook her head. I don't care about money. I just want my grandchildren to know that we were not always refugees, not always victims. We were people with dignity, with culture, with achievements. That's what these documents prove. They spent hours at the dining room table, going through everything. Hannah sharing memories, and Rebecca taking notes and photographs. Margaret served coffee and sandwiches, which mostly went uneaten, as Hannah was too absorbed in the treasures before her. David recorded some of Hannah's recollections, creating an oral history to accompany the physical artifacts. As the afternoon wore on, Hannah turned to Margaret with tears in her eyes again. You saved my family's memory. If you had thrown away that piano like people told you to do, all of this would have been lost forever. My father's letter would never have been read. These photographs would never have been seen again. You gave me back my childhood, my parents, my history. How can I ever thank you? Margaret felt her own tears flowing freely now. You don't need to thank me. I'm just grateful that I kept the piano, that I was stubborn enough to ignore everyone who said it was worthless. Your father trusted Jakob Hoffmann to save these things, and Jakob trusted his brother-in-law to get them to your Aunt Ilsa. They all did their part. I just happened to be the last link in that chain. Please remember that we loved each other. Please remember that we were human beings. The piano ensured that wish came true. It stood as a testament to resilience, to the power of memory, to the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary evil. And it stood in Margaret's living room, no longer dismissed as an old relic, but recognized for what it truly was, a miracle of survival, a guardian of history, and proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are always those who will fight to preserve the light. Before Hannah left that evening, she asked if she could play the piano. Rebecca helped her to the bench, and Hannah sat down with visible emotion, her hands hovering over the yellowed keys. I haven't played in 40 years, she said. My arthritis makes it difficult. But this piano, I must try. She began to play, hesitantly at first, hitting wrong notes and pausing to remember. But gradually, muscle memory took over, and a melody emerged. It was Brahms, a simple lullaby that her mother had played for her as a child. The sound was imperfect, the piano still slightly out of tune, Hannah's fingers stiff with age. But to everyone listening, it was the most beautiful music they had ever heard. It was the sound of a family reunited across time, of memories preserved against all odds, of love that had survived even the darkest chapter of human history. When Hannah finished, she sat with her hands on the keys for a long moment. My mother played this for me in Shanghai, she said quietly. We had no piano there, but she would tap the rhythm on a table and hum the melody. She said that music couldn't be taken from us, that it lived in our hearts even when everything else was gone. I think she would be so happy to know that I got to play her piano again, that I got to see her face in these photographs, that I got to read my father's words one more time. Rebecca helped her mother stand, and Hannah turned to Margaret. Would it be terribly presumptuous of me to ask you something? Anything, Margaret said. Would you keep the piano? I know it belongs to me now, technically. It was my family's, and the things hidden inside were meant for me. But I'm 92 years old. I live in a retirement community with no room for a piano. And, more importantly, this piano saved my family's memory because you were wise enough to value it, to protect it, to refuse to let others convince you it was worthless. I would like it to stay here with you, where it's been safe all these years. I would like to know that someone who understands its importance is caring for it. Margaret was stunned. Hannah, I couldn't. It's your family's piano. Your father chose it, your mother played it, You learned your first notes on it." Hannah smiled through her tears. "And now you will be its guardian. You will know its story, and maybe someday you will tell others about what it carried across the ocean. This piano is more than wood and strings. It's proof that even in the darkest times, people find ways to preserve hope and memory. That's a story worth sharing. Will you do that for me? Will you keep the piano and tell its story?" Margaret looked at the piano, the instrument that had been the center of so many arguments with Linda, that she had defended and protected without knowing why. Now she understood. Some things were worth keeping, not because of their monetary value, but because they carried the weight of human experience. The evidence of courage and love in impossible circumstances. "Yes," Margaret said. "I'll keep it. I'll take care of it, and I'll make sure people know about your family and what they survived." They made plans for Hannah to return with her family, to bring her children and grandchildren to see the piano and hear its story. Professor Morris and David discussed creating an exhibit at the university, using the Bergman family's artifacts to teach students about the Holocaust and the creative ways people had tried to save their heritage. Dr. Chen would work on preserving the documents and photographs, ensuring they would last for future generations. As Rebecca helped Hannah to the car, the old woman paused on the doorstep and looked back at Margaret. "You know what's miraculous about all this? My father wrote in his letter that he wanted people to remember we were human beings, that we existed, that we loved each other. That was his deepest wish. And now, 87 years later, because of a piano and a stubborn woman who refused to throw it away, his wish has come true. People will remember. My family will remember. That's his victory over everything they tried to do to us." After they left, Margaret sat alone with the piano. She thought about all the hands that had touched these keys. Samuel and Ruth Bergman in their Berlin home, before the world fell apart. Hannah as a little girl, learning simple melodies. Thomas's grandmother, Ilsa, playing every day but never retrieving what was hidden inside. Perhaps unable to face the confirmation of her brother's fate. Thomas himself, who had bought the piano at an estate sale and insisted it had character. And now Margaret, the final guardian of this remarkable instrument. Over the following weeks, the story of the piano spread beyond Margaret's quiet living room. A local newspaper ran an article about the discovery, which was picked up by national outlets. Television crews came to interview Margaret and Hannah. The university held a special event where the photographs and documents were displayed. And Hannah spoke about her memories of her parents and their ordeal. Most surprisingly to Margaret, the publicity led to other discoveries. A woman in California contacted Professor Morris to say that her grandfather had worked in Jakob Hoffmann's workshop in Berlin. She had letters he had written describing the secret project to hide valuables in pianos for Jewish families trying to escape. A Holocaust researcher in Germany found records suggesting that at least 30 Hoffmann pianos had been exported to America between 1938 and 1939, which meant there might be other hidden packages waiting to be discovered. Linda, who had been so insistent about throwing away the piano, became one of its strongest advocates. She helped Margaret respond to the flood of letters and emails from people interested in the story. She even started researching other estate sales and antique shops, wondering if more Hoffmann pianos might be gathering dust in attics and basements across America. Robert Chen, the piano tuner who had made the initial discovery, gave interviews about the importance of looking closely at old instruments, of understanding that they might carry hidden history. He started checking the interiors of other pianos more carefully during his tuning appointments, though he never found anything as dramatic as what had been hidden in Margaret's piano. 3 months after the discovery, Hannah returned with her entire family. Her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren filled Margaret's living room. 3 generations who had all grown up without knowing their family's full history. Hannah showed them the photographs, explaining who everyone was, sharing the stories her parents had told her. The children were fascinated by the picture of young Hannah on her tricycle. The adults wept over Samuel's letter and the evidence of the life the Bergmans had lost. Hannah's oldest great-grandchild, a girl of 12 named Sarah, was particularly captivated by the piano. She had been taking lessons for 3 years and asked shyly if she could play it. Hannah nodded, and Sarah sat down at the bench. She played a modern piece, something contemporary and bright, and the sound filled the room with joy. "This is perfect," Hannah said, watching her great-grandchild play. "This piano carried my family's past, but now it's part of their future too. Sarah will remember playing it. She'll tell her children about it someday." The story continues. Margaret realized then what the piano had become. It wasn't just an instrument or a historical artifact. It was a bridge across time, connecting generations, preserving memory, proving that love and hope could survive even the worst humanity had to offer. Jakob Hoffmann and his workers had built it to make music, but they had transformed it into something much more important: a vessel for the preservation of human dignity. The university eventually created a permanent exhibit about the piano and the Bergman family. The instrument itself remained in Margaret's living room, but detailed photographs and replicas of the documents were displayed alongside testimonies from Holocaust survivors and information about the rescue efforts of people like Jakob Hoffmann, who had risked everything to help their Jewish neighbors and friends. Margaret became a speaker, traveling to schools and community centers to tell the story of the piano. She talked about the importance of preserving family history, of not dismissing old things as worthless, of understanding that objects can carry profound meaning beyond their monetary value. She always emphasized Hannah's message that even in the darkest times, people find ways to preserve hope. 5 years after the discovery, Hannah passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 96. At her funeral, her family displayed the photographs from the piano, and many of the mourners commented on how Hannah looked just like her mother. Ruth, Margaret attended the service and met Hannah's extended family. Dozens of people who existed because Samuel and Ruth had survived Shanghai, because they had fought to stay alive and build a new life in America. In her will, Hannah left the ruby necklace and earrings to her granddaughters, asking them to wear them and remember the grandmother they had never met. The pocket watch went to her grandson, who had it repaired and wore it on special occasions. The family record book and photographs were donated to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where they would be preserved forever and used to educate future generations. Margaret continued to care for the piano, having it tuned regularly and making sure it remained playable. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit at the bench and press the keys gently, thinking about all the music this instrument had heard, all the stories it had kept secret for so long. She thought about Samuel Bergman's final plea: "Please remember that we existed."